The clock on the wall ticked faintly, its rhythm invasive in the suffocating silence. He sat in his car for a moment longer than necessary, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing tethering him to reality. The shift had been grueling, 12 hours of movement, orders barked over radios, and fleeting snatches of exhaustion. But the weariness that clung to him now wasn't from work. It was the weight of going home. He dragged himself out of the car, his shoulders slumped, and his footsteps slow as he approached the front door. The porch light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the steps. He paused, taking a deep breath, knowing instinctively what waited for him inside. The air felt heavier as he stepped through the door, the sound of the latch echoing unnaturally loud. Her voice hit him before he even set down his bag. "You forgot the towels." The words were sharp, cutting through the air like glass. She stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes narrowed with a venom that didn't match the triviality of her accusation. He blinked at her, too tired to muster a response. His mind scrambled for context. Towels? He didn't remember the last time he touched the dryer. "You can't even do one thing right, can you?" she snapped, her voice rising. "After everything I do for you." His bag slipped from his hand, landing with a soft thud. He stared at her, unblinking, his expression unreadable. The edges of her form seemed to blur, a trick of the dim light, or perhaps his mind playing games again. The shadows were there. He could see them now, writhing in her periphery, coiling around her wrists and shoulders. They fed on her anger, pulsing with delight at every barb she threw. "You don't care about this relationship," she continued, her voice cracking with fury. "You don't care about me. Do you even love me?" He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. Years of walking this tightrope had taught him that any response would only fan the flames. He had learned to be silent, to become invisible. It was the only way to survive. Her first blow caught him off guard, her foot connected with his thigh, sending a jolt of pain up his leg. He didn't flinch. "Say something," she shouted, her fists pounding against his shoulders now, each hit harder than the last. "You're not even a man. You're pathetic." He stood still, his hands at his sides, his face blank. The shadows surged around her, their tendrils lashing out, feeding off the chaos. They seemed to grow larger, darker, their whispers barely audible over the sound of her rage. "Do you hear me?" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Why won't you fight back? Why won't you do anything?" But he didn't move. He didn't react. Inside, he felt nothing but a dull ache, a void where his emotions used to live. Her words, her fists, even the shadows. None of it reached him anymore. He had become numb. The room felt smaller now, the air heavy with tension. She stood in front of him, her chest heaving, her fists clenched at her sides. The shadows twisted and writhed around her, their forms almost humanoid now. One leaned close to her ear, its voice a low hiss. "Show him he's wrong," it whispered. "Show him you matter." Her eyes burned with a wild desperation as she turned and stormed toward the kitchen. He didn't follow. He couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the floor, his body heavy with exhaustion and something deeper, something he didn't dare name. When she returned, the glint of the knife in her hand caught the light, and his stomach dropped. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. Inside, a war raged between the instinct to intervene and the knowledge that this was another trap. He had seen it before. The manipulation, the theatrics, the desperate bids for control. And yet, something about the way her hand shook, the way the shadows pressed closer, made his chest tighten. "Stop," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "You don't want to do this." But she didn't hear him. Or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. The blade pressed against her skin, a thin line of red blossoming where the edge met flesh. The shadows convulsed, their forms shuddering with excitement. The cut was deeper than she had intended. Her eyes widened in shock as blood began to trickle down her neck, staining her shirt. She staggered, the knife clattering to the ground as she reached for him, her hands flying to her throat in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. He watched, frozen, as she stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. She crumpled to the floor, the shadows descending on her like vultures. They fed greedily, their forms pulsating as they consumed the chaos, their forms coiling around her like smoke, their tendrils sinking into her skin, her breath hitching as they drained her. The scene before him was grotesque, horrifying, but he couldn't feel it. He thought he should feel something, panic, sorrow, guilt, but there was only emptiness. The years of abuse had hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell that no longer recognized itself. The shadows turned their attention to him, their glowing eyes narrowing. They slithered closer, their tendrils reaching for his face, his chest, lapping at the glowing bruise on his thigh, arm, his mind. But they recoiled, their forms flickering with confusion. There was nothing left of him to feed on. The silence after her collapse was almost as loud as the chaos before it. Her blood seeped slowly across the cold floor, a dark and accusing stain. The knife, now useless, rested limply in her hand, the shadows twisted in frantic ecstasy, their tendrils dipping greedily into the pooling crimson, as if savoring her anguish. The room reeked of copper and finality. Motionless, his body, heavy with exhaustion, could barely process the enormity of it all. He had no tears left to cry, no anger left to wield. Just numbness. The shadows crept toward him, testing the boundaries of his frame with their dark tendrils, brushing lightly against his skin. But there was nothing left to draw from him, no despair, no fight, no hope. They recoiled, frustrated, circling him like vultures circling a corpse, waiting for the smallest crack in his defenses. The largest shadow lingered above her lifeless body, its dark form pulsating. It turned slowly, almost reluctantly, its eyes, those glowing red pinpricks of malice, shifting toward him one final time. It studied him, weighing, calculating. But then, as if bored with his emptiness, it retreated, its form dissolving into the air. The others followed, their movements deliberate, languid, satisfied with their feast, but not yet full. They pulled into the corners of the room, merging with the darker spaces, as if waiting for something unseen. And then they turned. The shadows' eyes, a multitude of them, glowing and unblinking, shifted, not toward him, but outward, beyond the walls of the room. Toward you, reader. Toward anyone who dared to linger too long in the silence. Their gaze bore into the unseen, sharp and knowing, a sinister invitation to imagine who might be next. Their whispers began again, soft and insidious, curling into the edges of the narrative like smoke. We're not finished. There's always another. And with that, they disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a cold, suffocating stillness. The room was dark, the faint glow of the overhead light casting long, empty shadows on the walls. The only sound was the shallow, uneven breathing of the man who remained. A hollow figure in a room that would never feel like home again.